President Andrew Jackson has a complicated legacy. On the one hand, he was a populist hero and a venerated war general. On the other hand, he was a slaving genocidal maniac who drove the economy into the ground like a meteor shard. Today, we're talking about Old Hickory, President Andrew Jackson. Before we get started, make sure you subscribe to Weird History and let us know about which American historical figure you'd like us to explore. Now, let's go back in time. Before he was a politician, Andrew Jackson was a military officer. And during the War of 1812, Jackson was shot in the arm. The cure for bullet arm in those days was to chop off the whole thing and throw it in the nearest trash can. But Jackson wasn't having that. Jackson sought out a more holistic solution among the Cherokee, and it worked. And with that, Andrew Jackson went on to protect the people who generously saved his arm beneath the presidential mantle, providing them with civil rights under the law and ushering in an age of peace, harmony, and culture. Just kidding. Instead, 1 year into his presidency, Jackson authored one of the most twisted moments in American history. He signed the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which made it okay, legally, for the government to snatch native territories and herd residents westward into a new Indian colonization zone, which is government speak for internment camp. The ICZ was distinct from the U.S., so its people enjoyed no protection under the law. That zone is now called Oklahoma, home of Garth Brooks. Now, under this act, the U.S. Army supposedly couldn't force indigenous peoples to hand their lands over, but the U.S. Army has never been good at not stealing from Native Americans, much like Andrew Jackson. The first tribe to follow the trail, some double-marched in literal chains as if armed escort wasn't enough, were the Choctaw, one of the 5 civilized tribes who adopted European customs to make their twitchy American neighbors less uncomfortable and still lost their homes. The Supreme Court actually found that the state had no authority to pull this nonsense, but Jackson didn't let that bother him. The forced march, made without food or supplies, claimed 4,000 lives. All told, over 70,000 Native Americans would be uprooted from their homes and driven westward to diminish, dwindle, and die. Jackson was a man of many monikers. Political opponents called him King Mob for his ability to rile the electorate into a frothing ball of violence, and his election campaign was based largely in his being an experienced Indian fighter, a career that earned him the name Sharp Knife among the Cherokee he routinely slaughtered. Yeah, it wasn't a positive nickname. After bitter fighting during the Creek War, Jackson oversaw the Creek tribe's terms of surrender. The terms were brutal. The Creek people had to surrender about 23 million acres of their land, which encompassed more than half of present-day Alabama and part of Georgia, to the federal government. And then we had the Seminole War, the left sock of America's dirty laundry. Before Jackson got involved, Florida belonged to Spain and was home to a coalition of former slaves and Seminole Indians, an alliance that freaked Southerners out so much that they routinely sent armed posses of kidnappers over the border. Under secret orders, Jackson sent the U.S. Army into the Sunshine State, aiming to take it by right of conquest and crush the Indians and former slaves there. He ordered his men to raise crops, abduct women and children, and deploy attack dogs. After the war, he proudly wrote to his wife, "I think I may say that the Indian War is at an end for the present. The enemy is scattered over the whole face of the earth, and at least one half must starve and die with disease." Good job? The official website for the Hermitage, a museum based at Jackson's Tennessee plantation estate, states, "In all reality, slavery was the source of Andrew Jackson's wealth." And that's in his museum. Jackson owned 161 slaves at the time of his death. While all previous presidents had slaves, Jackson had a few fingers in the human trafficking pie. He made his living in the domestic slave trade, which for him spanned from Virginia to New Orleans. When one of Jackson's slaves succeeded in a brave bid for freedom, Jackson offered a $50 reward and $10 extra for every 100 lashes a person will give to the amount of 300. In 1821, he instructed his nephew to lash a woman called Betty should she continue putting on some airs. The fatal stabbing of a runaway slave named Gilbert supposedly humanized his approach, but he would continue to peddle flesh until his death in 1845. In 1806, attorney and famed duelist Charles Dickinson called the future president a coward and equivocator, and his wife a bigamist over a horse racing argument. Jackson and his wife were technically bigamous, by the way. When he married her, she was already someone else's wife. A butthurt Jackson, never one to take a high road when his manhood was threatened, challenged Dickinson to a duel. Dickinson, an expert marksman, shot first and hit Jackson in the chest, shattering 2 of his ribs, and then, for his next act of manly chutzpah, remained where honor required him to stand, 24 feet from the wounded Jackson, who still had to take his shot if he could. Ironically, this took so long that Jackson's honor was impugned anyway, but he eventually managed to pull himself together enough to get off a fatal shot at his defamer. Jackson would go on to engage in over 100 duels over the course of his life, nearly dying of a ruptured artery after he tried to horsewhip a man who would one day become one of his top allies in the Senate, because that's how he rolled. Andrew Jackson loathed the Bank of the United States. His actions against the bank would plunge the country into a nationwide economic depression. In 1832, Jackson shut down the Bank of the United States, opting instead to keep the nation's money in an under-regulated pet bank, which loaned money to just about anyone who came asking. As any competent economist could have told him, this led to inflation. Then Jackson had another on-brand idea. Stop letting people buy land with paper money. He just didn't trust it, which no longer surprises us at this point. This specie circular, issued by Jackson on July 11, 1836, decreed that land could only be bought with gold or silver. Fairly naturally, this law slowed land speculation to a crawl, which led to decreased revenue for the states, which led in turn to the Panic of 1837. Near the end of the War of 1812, General Jackson arrived in New Orleans to find the city in disarray. Taking immediate command of the situation, Jackson put the city under martial law until the war was over, or so he said. He wouldn't actually lift the ban until months after the fighting had stopped. When a Louisiana state senator wrote of his apprehension at the idea of an open-ended martial law, Jackson had the senator arrested. Then, when one of those pesky district court judges demanded that the senator be charged or released in keeping with the Constitution of the United States, Jackson not only refused to do so, he ordered the judge jailed and then kicked him out of New Orleans forever. During his campaign, King Mob promised political positions to his key supporters. Then, on the night of his inauguration, office seekers so crowded the White House that it became less a party and more a riot. Instead of ending corruption as his populist message promised, Jackson's administration had been credited with creating a spoils system in which Jackson purged federal employees in favor of those who had supported him. At the start of his presidency, Jackson removed 919 government officials, a full 10% of all government employees, and dismissed 423 postmasters, many with long and credible records of service, within the first year of his tenure in office. When abolitionist literature began to flood the American South, Andrew Jackson did exactly what a man who had recently established unlimited martial law would do. He banned it. In the mid-1830s, abolitionists started what was probably the first direct mail campaign by sending its unsolicited materials to Southerners' mailboxes. The Southerners did not appreciate this, as their livelihoods depended on them being able to pretend what they were doing was natural. I have read with great sorrow and regret that such men live in our happy country. I might have said monsters, as to be guilty of the attempt to stir up amongst the South the horrors of a servile war. They deserve to atone for this wicked attempt with their lives. The Jackson administration would seek to ban all inflammatory abolitionist material from being delivered by the Postal Service. It's worth noting that it was about this time that Jackson supposedly decided to see to it that his Hermitage slaves were treated with more humanity. If he ever read it, abolitionist literature would have informed him of just how pathetically fantastical the mask of the good master he crafted for himself really was. Andrew Jackson had many issues with his first vice president, John Calhoun, and on one occasion he literally threatened to behead him. Jackson and Calhoun disagreed on the nullification crisis, leading Jackson to remark, "John Calhoun, if you secede from my nation, I will secede your head from the rest of your body." When Jackson agreed with the Supreme Court, like he did when the court sided with him against South Carolina's federal nullification laws, for example, he said it was the country's ultimate power and must be obeyed. Whenever Jackson disagreed with the Supreme Court, though, he got pissy and outright ignored them. In Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, stated Georgia laws that purported to seize Cherokee lands on which gold had been found violated federal treaties. Jackson, unapologetically set on taking said land and gold, reportedly responded, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." While historians are unsure if Jackson actually ever said that, they know that both he and the state of Georgia completely ignored the ruling and just stole everything. Obviously, you're just as shocked as we are that the man who closed the National Bank could do something so fiscally irresponsible. When he was 16, Jackson inherited 300 to 400 pounds sterling from his late grandfather. It would be gone within the year, mainly because Old Hickory was as good at gambling as he was at finance. Just ask Charles Dickinson. When King Mob was inaugurated in 1829, massive crowds came to see him. At the time, the White House was open on Inauguration Day, and the first to arrive were Jackson's favorite toadies, most of whom were seeking an audience with the president to discuss the government positions he promised them for making it rain votes all over him. Then came the actual mob. Thousands of supporters guzzled booze, smashed furniture and china, and even mashed cheese into the White House carpets under their boots. We think the cheese was probably already on the floor, but it's not really safe to assume with this man. One fancy society woman wrote, "But what a scene did we witness. The majesty of the people had disappeared, and a rabble, a mob of boys, Negroes, women, children, scrambling, fighting, romping. What a pity. What a pity." Jackson seemed to agree. He escaped out the back window, leaving the White House to the raucous crowd while he went on to whatever lunatics do when they get elected to high office. He eventually used the event as an opportunity to get $50,000 from Congress to redecorate the White House, though. One thing we can definitively say about Andrew Jackson, the president, he really knew how to take a bad situation and exploit the shit out of it. What do you think of Andrew Jackson? Love him or hate him? Let us know in the comments, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos of our weird history.